Welcome. Before we start, take a look at this map. This is a map of what historians term Afro-Eurasia. Occupying most of the map is the giant continent of Eurasia, which includes Europe at its western extremity to the left and Asia to the east to the right. While both Europe and Asia are often mistakenly treated as separate continents for cultural reasons, they each are in reality subcontinents, constituting together a single giant continent known as Eurasia. To the lower left of the map is a portion of Africa. We use the term Afro-Eurasia because over thousands of years, humans that lived in this vast region of the world were continuously interconnected with one another through trade, war, and migration. This meant that Afro-Eurasians learned from one another faster than they would have otherwise, which is partly why Afro-Eurasia witnessed the rise and fall of so many advanced civilizations over thousands of years after the invention of agriculture some 10,000 years ago. Before Christopher Columbus accidentally stumbled upon the Americas in 1492, and before the European voyages of exploration that followed, peoples in other parts of the world, and in particular in the Americas and Australasia, were isolated from the rest of humanity. What this meant was that Native Americans and Native Australasians had until 1492 no or limited access to technological and other Afro-Eurasian advances and advantages, which would make them terribly vulnerable to conquest by Europeans after 1492. Now let's turn to this topic's two big questions. The first concerns the extraordinary transformation that occurred to humanity beginning a few centuries ago. We refer to these profound changes as the modern revolutions, or, in the singular, the modern revolution. The term revolution is used by historians to describe a dramatic change, whether political, economic, or social. Such revolutionary change can occur quickly, as is often the case for political revolutions, or over a longer period of time. About 250 years ago occurred in England, a once relatively poor island country in the northeastern corner of Afro-Eurasia, an incredible technological and economic transformation we refer to as the world's first Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was the most important of the series of other changes we lump together and describe as the Modern Revolution. The Industrial Revolution was transformative in many ways, including by creating the technology that allows us to support our current lifestyles, which are completely dependent on automated machines fueled by fossil energy sources such as coal, natural gas, and petroleum. Our first task will be to introduce the main ways the modern revolutions, and especially the Industrial Revolution, changed our world. Our first reading by historian David Christian summarizes such changes. Our second major topic of discussion will concern where the first modern revolutions occurred, most notably the Industrial Revolution, which begins, as I said, in England around 1780. Now, why did these changes which created the modern world first occur in Europe? Why did Europeans, not other equally rich and civilized peoples, such as, for example, the Chinese or the Indians or others, first initiate the Industrial Revolution? Why England, not China, in other words? We will try to answer this question this week by reading an article by New York Times journalist Nicholas Kristof, who comes up with some possible answers. Finally, now, in order to truly appreciate how transformative these modern revolutions were, we must sketch what the world looked like before the modern era, before the modern revolutions. What was the pre-modern world like? Pre-modern civilizations, in other words, human societies before industrialization, are often referred to as agrarian. Agrarian civilizations first emerged around 10,000 years ago, where environmental conditions permitted the cultivation of land for agricultural purposes. In other words, fertile lands that were relatively well watered by rivers or by rain, such as Mesopotamia, present-day Iraq, Egypt, China, Central America, Andean South America, Europe, India, China, and regions in Africa. Agrarian civilizations depended primarily on agriculture, as well as the domestication or taming of useful animals, especially cattle, sheep, horses, and pigs. Thanks to their capacity to produce surplus food, agrarian civilizations produced population growth, increased wealth, and more complex and hierarchical societies. The relative abundance of food meant some members of society could specialize in other activities than growing food, for example, metal crafting or inventing writing and other advanced technologies, trading, waging wars. What it meant in effect was that not everybody had to spend all their time growing food. Some people, a minority, could do something else. Before 1492, there were many advanced and rich agrarian civilizations, but most of them were in Afro-Eurasia. Among the most advanced and rich were Chinese civilization to the east, the Islamic world in the center of Afro-Eurasia, and the many societies of Renaissance Europe in the west. Native American civilizations, such as those of the Aztecs and the Incas, were also relatively advanced, but not quite as much as Afro-Eurasian ones, due to their complete isolation. The pre-modern agrarian world had many centers of wealth and power. In other words, it was multipolar. Take a look at this funny-looking map that distorts real world geography to reflect the wealthiest societies around 1500 when our story begins in this course. The bigger the total wealth of a country, the bigger it appears relative to its actual physical size on this map. Notice how gigantic China and India are, and how small or skinny parts of the world without large, advanced, and rich agrarian civilizations are. For example, much of the Americas, sub-Saharan Africa, or Australia, which lacked an agrarian civilization and therefore appears as mere dots on the map. Europe, particularly Western Europe, colored in pinkish tones, is big, but not quite as big as China and India, which are colored in green and yellow respectively. The important takeaway of this map is that the pre-modern agrarian world was multipolar. In other words, that it had many centers of wealth and power, not a single pole of wealth and power, as would later be the case as a result of the modern revolutions. Another way to put it is that around 1492 and even as late as 1780, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution that begins in England, 1780, no one people or one world region dominated the rest of humanity or the world. China was powerful and rich and produced manufactured goods such as silk and cotton textiles and porcelain that were avidly sought further west. But China did not dominate India, nor the rest of the Muslim world, nor Europe, though the Chinese did exert some control over their neighbors, such as the Vietnamese to their south. Indeed, before 1492, the various states that constituted Renaissance Europe were growing in wealth, but as yet exerted little influence or power outside of Europe. All of that would change, as we'll see, as a consequence of the events that we will be describing in this class. Politically speaking, most agrarian civilizations everywhere, including Europe or China, were organized as kingdoms or empires ruled by kings, queens, or emperors. Especially powerful kingdoms, which included many different cultures or ethnic groups, were generally known as empires and were ruled by an emperor, which was a sort of super king. Emperors presided in the pre-modern era over what are known as tributary empires. They are known as such because emperors demanded periodic tributes or payments in cash or kind from less powerful rulers. We will return to this definition of pre-modern tributary empires later in the course. Kings or emperors had in common that they ruled by what was called divine right. In other words, they believed and were believed to derive their power directly from above. In other words, from God or the gods, not from below, in other words, from the people or from democratic processes, as would become the case in the modern era, as a result of the modern revolutions we will be discussing. All agrarian rulers, in other words, were absolutist rulers with unquestionable, absolute or complete power over their subjects. Inequality was written into the very fabric of all agrarian societies, whether Asian, European, or African. Its best known manifestation in Europe was feudalism, a very hierarchical system. In feudal societies, a narrow caste of powerful military and religious aristocracies with ownership of most of a society's land ruled over a vast majority of peasants or farmers. Aristocrats and peasants were more than separate social classes in the modern sense of the word. They were like separate categories of human beings, one held to be inherently superior or inferior to the other. Now, aristocrats and peasants had mutual obligations to one another, and in this sense, the system was fair. Peasants' job was to grow food for society, aristocratic knights to provide physical safety as warriors or spiritual salvation as religious leaders, as well as access to land as landowners. Social mobility, a feature of the later modern world, was virtually absent and heavily disapproved of. Once born a peasant, a person was supposed to always remain a peasant. Conversely, aristocrats only intermarried with their own kind and were deemed to constitute a higher breed of humans. Such disapproval of social mobility was especially pronounced in Confucian China, where merchants, despite their greater wealth, were especially looked down upon by the higher social classes. Whether in Europe or China, or in any agrarian society in between, slavery, serfdom, poverty, social and other inequalities were seen not as injustice, but rather as the inevitable, eternal manifestations of a God-sanctioned conservative order. Peasants and aristocrats were not the only social classes of pre-modern agrarian civilizations. Since the emergence of the first interconnected agrarian societies across Afro-Eurasia, manufacturing of objects by artisans on the one hand, and trade of their goods by merchants on the other had emerged as distinctive features of civilized life. We will focus here on merchants because they are central to the argument of why the first modern revolutions, especially industrialization, first happened in Western Europe, not elsewhere. In the pre-modern world, while present, capitalists such as merchants, moneylenders, or bankers were generally few in number and limited in power. This is because merchants and business people were generally regarded with suspicion by rulers and subjects alike. The trading of goods, or even worse, the lending of money, were seen as parasitical, greedy, unproductive activities that did not produce real wealth, but rather just enriched a class of speculators who bought one good at a low price in order to sell it at a higher price and pocket the profit. By the same token, money lending at an interest was regarded as sinful and often labeled as the work of the devil. We will refer to business people in this course as capitalists. A capitalist is basically a business person who has access to private capital or cash, which he or she chooses to reinvest in new economic activity in order to generate profits. Capitalists such as merchants were regarded with suspicion also because they tended to be upwardly socially mobile, and due to their travels to distant lands, more cosmopolitan and forward-looking, thus potentially threatening the established agrarian order ruled by the landed aristocratic elites and their leaders, the monarch. Stability and stagnation, respect for traditions, not innovation and growth, were most valued in pre-modern agrarian civilizations, not change, progress, and transformation, as would later be the case in modern societies, especially after the Industrial Revolution. Let's conclude by returning to a central question that we will be debating in class. If merchant capitalists were central to the so-called rise of England, rise of Europe, in other words, the rise of the West, why did they not play such a role outside of Europe? Why not in China, for example? After all, around 1492, China was the single most successful commercial society on earth, and its merchants quite literally filthy rich. Why would merchant capitalists later emerge as a potent force for economic progress in Western Europe, not in China? Why would merchant capitalists help fuel Industrial Revolution after 1780 in Lancashire, England, not the Yangtze Valley, China? We will debate this question in class after reading and analyzing the article by Nicholas Kristof. Now, consider the graph above. Among the consequences of the modern revolutions, and especially the first Industrial Revolution, was the so-called Great Divergence, which, like population growth in the modern era, broke with earlier patterns in world history. The Great Divergence describes the incredible, unprecedented increase in wealth production after around 1800, as seen in this illustration. The graph shows the increase over time in gross domestic product, or GDP, per person per selected countries. GDP means total wealth produced divided by the population number in a given country when measured as GDP per person. GDP is a simple measure of wealth for a given country or region, involving adding up all goods and services produced over a given time. GDP per person, or per capita, divides GDP per population number, providing a more precise measure of a country's wealth. Notice that it was only those societies that experienced an early industrial revolution, and more specifically England, in dark blue above, that grew immensely wealthy and powerful after 1780, leaving behind until very recently other civilizations that were once rich and powerful, namely China and India, in red and pink in the graph above. Asking the question, why England and Europe, not China and Asia, therefore also helps us answer a more general question we will be tackling in this course, which is, why are some countries rich and others poor? We will see that the origins of the uneven distribution of world wealth and poverty are rooted in developments that began several centuries ago, at the very beginning of the modern age. Once again, remember that before 1492, the world was, generally speaking, multipolar. It had many centers of wealth and power. The unipolar world, which would emerge especially after the Industrial Revolution, is a relatively recent development.